Thank you, everybody who's joining in person today. It's nice to see everybody live, and thanks to everyone else who's joining remotely. It's really nice to be here, and Lena for the invitation to join. This is a topic that I think is really important and has been driving a lot of my research interest for the last couple of years, from when I was at NREL and then also transitioning to DTU Wind Energy. So the presentation I'm giving today is a little bit of old, a little bit of new, and it reflects a lot of input. So this is, a reflection of work that involves many people from both when I was at NREL, part of the Grand Vision effort, and then also here at DTU Wind Energy, working with many colleagues. And the green button will go forward, I think. Maybe. Or this green button. Nope. There it goes. Okay. All right, now we're on track. So we've talked a bit already here at this conference about kind of this grand challenge vision. This is an effort that has now been going on for a few years. And the idea is, we've come so far with wind energy, but if we really want to go to the next level and make wind energy the foundation of our clean, carbon neutral, sustainable energy system, how do we get there? If we want to transform our energy system to be based on 50% or more of wind energy, 80% or more of renewables, how do we get there? What will it take to achieve that goal? So firstly, of course, we need to be competitive on LCOE. This is really important, especially in a power purchase agreement world. Generally, in any world where we're competing on commodity prices, we need to have really cheap electricity coming from wind energy. And we've done a really good job of making wind energy competitive globally in many regions of the world on a levelized cost of energy, LCOE basis, and we're continuing to drive down those costs, which is really great. But we're also seeing that the markets are changing, especially in areas, regions within Europe and in the US and other places where we're seeing more and more wind shares in the system going from 5% up towards 10% and higher. We're seeing shifts. We're seeing pressure to have wind energy compete and operate in merchant energy markets, much like traditional fossil fuel-based generation. We're seeing potentially a shift in market structures. As we have more and more cheap energy, cheap electrons in the system, will there be a shift to providing more revenue to other type of aspects of supporting the electricity system, the capacity markets, the service markets, which provide reliability to the system? So we're seeing downward pressure on energy prices, which is a positive result of there being a lot of cheap wind in the system, but this also affects profitability, and it also strains potentially the reliability of the broader system going forward if we're not actually valuing these other services and capacity markets the way they need to be. So for wind in the future, we need to be competitive on LCOE, but we also need to think about these changing dynamics in energy markets and how they may affect profitability of wind going forward and our ability to deploy more and more wind. So success of wind energy in the future, this is coming from the Grand Vision group, depends on two things. If there is a future where we have huge transmission build out, storage is really, really cheap, we have tons of power to X, demand is highly elastic and can change on the fly, then maybe all wind needs to do in the future is provide really cheap electrons. But if the system is more constrained, if dispatchability matters, if predictability, controllability matter, if the capacity value of wind matters, then maybe we need to rethink how we actually design and operate wind farms to provide more value within a market context. And from a broader perspective, if we're thinking about system design and operation and optimization of the system, these two objectives may actually oppose each other. So, when we're trying to drive down LCOE, we may not be improving the value. And if we want to improve the value coming from wind energy to the system, that may come actually at a cost of LCOE and LCOE increase. So that was kind of the context we started from, and I know we've talked a little bit about this in the last couple of days, and this isn't the main focus of my presentation, but I can't be in a conference and not talk about the grand challenges, since it's still an ongoing effort. So we had this effort to kind of think about this future and think about the innovations for wind energy to actually drive down LCOE and improve the value, and how we could actually achieve and realize this vision of 50% or more of our electricity coming from wind energy. So that led us to creating these grand challenges. And they include three things. Firstly, these physics of atmospheric flow, looking at the scales, as we saw yesterday in the session on looking across the different scales that are of interest to wind energy. Looking at these massive, massive machines and the engineering, the science, down to the materials and the manufacturing that it's going to take to make these gigantic machines reliable and operate efficiently at low cost in future. And also, increasingly, how do we integrate fleets of these systems into the plant so that they support the electric grid, so that they maximize their value to the electricity system and the broader energy system? Pat Moriarty likes to talk about wind plants that dance with the electricity system, which I think is a really nice analogy. You know, it's sort of a dance where we want to see wind moving along with the energy system, and that being a very dynamic and fluid process. So, Grand Challenge 1, just a few more slides, one on each. So what we're talking about is massive, massive transitions in scales, going from these large-scale global weather effects down to regional levels, down to the plant levels, down to the individual machine level. And we had a very nice session focusing on that yesterday, where we saw the complexity involved, not just within these scales, but then going across these scales. And that's where a lot of the big challenges are, is how do we actually understand the physics of the flow all across these scales? How can we accurately predict it? And how can we design turbines and machines for that and control them over their lifetime? And increasingly, we need to think about these complementary effects of what is the wind farm and the wind turbines actually doing to impact these broader flow processes. So a big challenge, and many folks are involved looking at this. The second challenge on turbines or the machines themselves really focuses on the scales that are involved from an individual machine, which goes on the scale of hundreds of meters. Now we're looking at blades of 100 meters or more in length, down to micrometers, down to looking at the materials and how do we actually make composites that have the strength that they need to withstand operation for the design lifetime of 30 years or more in these massive dynamic machines that are constantly moving. And then the third challenge, how do we actually then, with these fleets of wind farms making up 50% of our electricity supply, provide the services and integrate nicely and play nicely with the electricity system? And so here you can see this is an old simulation now from NREL, but they actually looked at providing reactive power control and voltage control, looking at a joint simulation of the flow physics in the plants and adapting the controls of the individual turbines across the plants to provide that service support to the electricity system. So all these things are really important, and we need research on all these levels, but the focus for me today is really more on thinking from a design context, from an optimization context. How do we actually reflect these objectives of value and bring those closer into how we think about the design and operation of wind farms in the future? So looking at system design, operation, and control for metrics that go beyond LCOE. So LCOE is great. It's been a gold standard for how we think about how do we evaluate technologies and innovations, how do we assess the competitiveness of wind energy projects relative to other technologies. And it's complex in and of itself. It encompasses so many things related to the turbine design, the farm design, the resource, all the balance of system, the energy production over the lifetime. So the financing aspect, which is in and of itself a very complex thing I've learned from Lena. And so all of these things come together, and that's very complex. It has a huge scope, so many subsystems, so many physical disciplines, cost modeling the system, it's very complex. And there's also a lot of couplings. So, if you change the design in one part of the system, it has repercussions throughout the rest of the system. So changing the layout, for example, of an offshore wind farm affects the costing and sizing of support structures, the collection system costing, the energy production. So you have to look at all these things from a holistic perspective if you really want to assess a LCOE of any given innovation or design change. Another example, control strategy, right? For example, wake steering. We've talked a lot about that. That can actually enhance energy production, but what does that do to loading, reliability, operation, and maintenance costs for the farm? So we need to, again, look at things from a holistic perspective. So LCOE is complex already because it depends on the resource, the technology, the site design, local conditions, and more. But it's actually pretty simple if you talk to an economist. So, if you're thinking about going beyond LCOE, we're adding a huge amount of additional complexity. So we have time-varying revenues that are coming from markets, and these markets are actually also evolving over time. So it's not a stationary sort of set of revenues that we can plan to. The system context matters a lot, so the heterogeneity, where the wind plant is and what the system makeup is in that particular location matters. So what is the other generation in that system? What's the transmission infrastructure look like? What's the demand profile look like? We have evolving policy and regulatory contexts, and those can change and affect how the revenues of a farm might change over its lifetime. And there's uncertainties that abound in every aspect of the wind farm itself, but also the broader system context. So, we can move to such metrics that would capture this bigger context of the system and then also try to address the uncertainties and how they evolve over time. This would be very difficult. And if I'm thinking about a wind farm design perspective or a turbine design perspective, this becomes intractable. How could I actually bring into my turbine design optimization process on every iteration an evaluation how the system LCOE would be affected by that technology? So that's not possible for us that live in the design world. So what can we do? So system LCOE or other similar metrics that really look at the evaluation of the technology of the project within the broader system context, they're difficult to access because they're heterogeneous, as I mentioned, and they're uncertain, and all these things are evolving over time, so not very tractable for optimization contexts. Some ways that we can address this is, to simplify things, is to try to use statistical or surrogate models that kind of represent this broader system context, but that are tractable and simplified metrics that we can actually use in a design context. So one example of this that working with Juliet Simpson and Eric Loth at UVA, we looked at creating a couple years ago is basically a statistical relationship that relates the amount of wind share in a given system to the electricity pricing, which allows you to actually have a metric that you can use in a system design context. And I'm going to show an example of how we've applied that in actually a design context in a couple of slides. And going back to the point about LCOE versus value metrics, if you think about different things we can do to increase the value of the system, we can look at higher capacity factor turbines. We can look at low wind speed turbines. We can look at overplanting, increasing the number of turbines relative to the rated capacity of the plant. We can look at the operational strategies that we apply. Hybridization, adding storage, et cetera. All these things can add value, but they're likely to increase the cost of energy. And so there's this trade-off. And so we need to think about how do these different objectives actually drive our design and operation. So we've been doing a bit of work on this topic. Lena, myself, Philip Bieter, and others have been looking at this. There's kind of this analog you can create between the sort of LCOE world and the beyond LCOE world in terms of metrics. So going from LCOE-based metrics to value-based metrics. So this analog for annual energy production, there's this levelized revenue of energy that Philip and Lena and colleagues have developed, which really looks at capturing sort of that tie to the markets that wind farms have when they're participating in merchant markets. I mentioned COVE as an analog to LCOE. You could also look at capacity factor, and then an analog of that in a market context might be capacity value, where wind farms can actually participate in capacity markets, for example, in ISO New England in the US, as one example. So we've done some work now looking at how do these different metrics actually drive design in different directions. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now, is how do these different value objectives affect the wind project design and operation. So we can look at that from different aspects of the wind project lifecycle. So from the initial perspective, you have your site and technology selection. So which turbines are you going to use, but now what other technologies are you going to incorporate? Are you going to add storage? Are you going to include power to X or other technologies? For sizing, you can look at the capacity of the different generation assets, the electrical system topology as well, and decide how much of each of the rated powers. Okay. How much of the how much rated capacity are you going to have for each of the technology assets you have on site? Site design then gets into the actual, how do you design the site? How do you lay out the site? How do you design the collection system, especially the electrical side if you have multiple technology assets? And then how do you operate the plant? Looking at balancing the revenues and the costing over the project lifecycle. And I'm going to give a couple of examples to speak to each of these phases of the lifecycle. So here's an example from some of my colleagues at DTU on technology selection and sizing. So we've been doing a lot of work looking at hybrid power plants, plants that combine wind, solar PV, storage, and potentially other technologies as well. We've been looking at hydrogen and other things. So if we're trying to design a plant for a specific site, so this case study is based on a site in India, in particular market conditions there. If we were to optimize the site for a certain level of combined wind and solar capacity, what would that look like? And what would that look like if we add storage to it? And how would that actually perform from an LCOE versus an NPV perspective? And I think the important thing that you can see, I won't go into the details, but if you look at I think this guy doesn't, go forward. Oh, there we go. The bottom two columns here. So you can see that the LCOE for the hybridized plants with the batteries is actually higher than not having the storage technology there. But actually the NPV, which accounts for the time-varying revenues that the plant sees over its lifetime, is actually higher when you include the battery storage along with the wind and solar together. And actually, it is the highest value solution of all the options of just doing wind by itself, solar by itself, wind solar, or wind solar battery storage. So showing promising opportunities of having hybrid plants where you have multiple technologies together. So that's kind of from the early stage, selecting the technologies and picking out how much capacity you want of each technology together. You can also look at things from a physical design perspective. So how do we look at how AEP versus this levelized revenue of energy metric, or LCOE versus this cost of valued energy metric, affect the actual design of a wind farm? And so working with Lena and Philip and a master's student recently at DTU Wind Energy, Shimon, we have, with a very, very simplified, IEA Wind Task 37 reference site, looked at actually optimizing a wind farm design for these different metrics. And so the interesting thing here is that you see sort of these are not global optimums, but we get many different local optimums depending on where we start from. But you can see general patterns in them, where the LCOE metric, in order to really minimize the cost of energy, tends to push the turbines a bit closer together and minimize the collection system costs relative to the cost of valued energy solutions, which actually tend to push the turbines still further apart. So this revenue-based, this value-based metric actually has a stronger impact on kind of the push towards the spacing the layout farther than the LCOE metric does. And so that's an interesting finding. It's work that's ongoing, and obviously this is a very simple wind farm, but it does show that these metrics actually matter in terms of not just how you choose what technologies you're going to use, but actually how do you physically design the farm. And then the last example I'm going to show you is from the operational side. So it's great to talk about dispatching, a wind power plant or a hybrid power plant for revenue maximization. But as we know, wind turbine reliability is a huge issue, right? This is something that's non-trivial. The flow and loading within a wind farm affecting the individual machines over their lifetime is something that we need to pay attention to. So for this study, we looked at, for a single turbine, and we're now expanding it to multiple turbines, but in this case, for a single turbine, how do we actually take advantage of the ability to boost the power output or derate the power output of that turbine while keeping the damage equivalent loads, the loads that the turbine would see, the same as if it were operating always at its nominal power output. And so to do that, we developed a surrogate model of a wind turbine using our EERA elastic code HAWK2. Did this work in collaboration with Soren Joel Anderson and Juan Pablo Murcia Leon in collaboration with a few master's students, where we actually developed a surrogate model to handle these boosting conditions to get all the loads and the power output information from the EERA elastic code. We then use those surrogates to actually do an optimization, and it's hard to read this slide, so I apologize for that. But we first ran an unconstrained optimization where we said, let's ignore the loads and just try to maximize revenue overall for the plant, given the revenues that this plant would see, this turbine would see in a merchant market. And we can see that under those conditions, of course, the turbine wants to boost 100% of the time when prices are positive, prices go negative, it derates or curtails. But then if we're trying to actually balance the loads, then it's actually going to trade off power boosting when the prices are really high compared to when the prices are moderately high, so that it can actually extract more revenue when prices are high, and then essentially reserve, reserve more loads for when prices are high by derating when prices are lower, but still keeping its same damage equivalent load profile over the full time of operation. So those are a few examples, and there's a lot of work to still be done in this space. So what's needed? There's still a lot of work we need to do to drive wind to its full potential generally. We still need to work on the fundamental knowledge, these grand challenges, looking at the science of wind energy across these vast scales and time periods. But we also need to start thinking more about value objectives and how they affect our R&D. So from the system context and all the uncertainties that are involved, how do we actually maybe rethink a little bit of R&D, our R&D to address this new value-based world? And a huge amount of work is needed. We've been working together with Lena and others at DTU Energy on some research in this space, but there's a lot of potential for doing a lot more work in this area, looking at different objectives and adapting the objectives to address uncertainty and different market conditions, looking at their impact to turbine and farm design and operation, and more. So hope we'll see many more people getting involved with this space. And with that, I'll conclude. Thanks so much. So we do questions or?
Yeah, thank you very much, Katherine. I think we have time for one or two questions. All right. I have one on the web already. So why don't we start with Jake, and I'm going to read this one as well.
Thanks very much, Katherine. Really fascinating talk. I was wondering about maybe taking it to another scale. Maybe what about metrics that you could use more like from a state or country basis? So say if we've got, say, the German Bight or we've got the North Sea, you might want a metric that somehow says, instead of talking about euros or something, you might be talking about tons of CO2, and you may be saying, I'm not thinking from a farm perspective, I'm thinking of the whole even bigger complex of wind farm clusters, for example. So you might have an objective which is for a given area of offshore, how can I get the most CO2 reduction, for example? Are there ways that you could use this sort of methodology to reach that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think we're actually going to be speaking a little bit more on the broader environmental side of things as well. So, I was focusing really on, just the market perspective, but the sustainability, environmental impacts, CO2, these broader metrics are something that we've also talked quite a bit about, and I think actually we'll hear a bit more about in just a little bit. But to the point of going from what I was showing you, of course, was from an individual asset owner perspective, right? So, individual plant from a developer, and they're trying to say, how do I make my plant profitable over its lifetime? But you can also bring that up to the portfolio level, where developers, kind of managing a group of assets within a market or across markets, or even the broader system level. And so I focus kind of from the individual, farm perspective, because that's where most of my research is, but others are focusing on the broader system level.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I think we'll take Irene's question from the chat, and then afterwards Anu's. So Irene says, many thanks for the interesting talk. Do you think this added value of wind energy is actually perceived as such by the market? In other words, will this be a market-driven change of paradigm, or will it require further policy action?
Oh, that's a loaded question. No, I think, so, we are seeing this play out in markets where wind is starting to participate on a merchant basis. These are things that developers are actively thinking about, and hybridization, of course, is a huge part of that, but they are thinking about it from a especially operational perspective, and I think increasingly they'll be thinking about it from a design perspective as well, a site design. To the second part of the question, which was about regulatory or policy changes. I think some of this is tied to policy, where farms are being expected to participate in merchant markets, but also there's the reverse pressure of trying to increase more PPAs. So most of this matters more in a non-PPA world, and so I think that's kind of a dynamic that's an ongoing debate. Probably Lena can speak way more on that topic than I can.
I can hardly stop myself. But no, I would like to give one example, because I do think that policy has a huge impact on the way wind farms are designed and the way how investors, think about value. And one example is the Thor wind farm auction that's going on in Denmark right now. And the CFD design, so that's, when we say CFD, we mean a contract for difference. So that's the way the policy, the remuneration, the support is giving out to the wind farms. And it used to be on an hour-by-hour basis, so that they would guarantee to have this fixed price level in each hour. And this has been changed now to be an average basis. So now the wind energy will be feeling, the price variations much more inside the policy scheme. And the very clear political ambition why this has been changed was to influence the wind farm design, the choice of the turbine, to make it more system friendly. And we have done some analysis on that, and actually we think there is an incentive that you're going to choose lower specific power turbines because of this change in policy. So I think there is going to be a lot of influence by policy. If it's required for investors to go more into that direction, I don't know. I don't think so, actually. I think there are many more drivers than that, but it is definitely a factor. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I promised Anna's question as well.
Although you already answered part of that. Katherine showed how looking beyond LCOE changes, for instance, your wind farm layout. And you could take that one further, of course, and say that, okay, now the poor technical wind turbine designer that tries to make a nice, big, cheap, whatever the heck, wind turbine, what would your advice be to him? Like, for instance, does he have to increase the fatigue strength a little bit, so you have a bit more to play to keep your damage equivalent load in place? Or do you, low capacity is a clear one. Other ideas that you already have as hints for the designer?
Yeah, so I think great question, and everyone who's interested in that question should come to our workshop this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon, because we're going to talk a lot about that with people who have been doing a lot of research directly on that question. How do we design wind turbines for these contexts? From my perspective, I think there's a few trends, right? We see the low specific power trend that's been going on for some time. We think will continue. The low wind concept, where the turbine's actually designed to only operate in lower wind speeds, is another interesting one. A lot of these wind farm controls, I think, play into it as well. And so, we've seen wind farm control, and mostly we've been focusing on it for power increase, energy production increase, right? Wake steering for energy production increase, and that's where, a lot of there's been a huge amount of work going on in that space. But I think we're going to see more and more work looking at how do we actually, kind of over the lifetime of plants, take all these levers of, how many turbines and how we lay them out and how we control them and balance things to actually, kind of increase the profitability from these value perspectives, but also still design wind turbines and farms that are reliable and operate for 30 years, et cetera.
Cool. Thank you so much. And then I think we'll move on to Irate. Thank you.